Okay, so this is the second of the two PowerPoints that we're doing for the day, and it's all about angiosperms, how they're classified, and how they reproduce. This is section 22.3. So angiosperms all have their seed protected by an ovary, and if pollination occurs and fertilization of the ovules, then that ovary turns into a mature fruit, which you can see down here. That's different from our gymnosperms that have the naked seeds that are just part of the scale. And flowering plants are the most successful of all the plants on Earth. There are about 260,000 species of flowering plants. Examples include trees. If they flower, trees are angiosperms. Pretty much anything that we eat, that's a fruit or a vegetable. Obviously anything that has flowers, and even some stuff that has flowers that you might not have realized, for example, grass. And in these diagrams on the bottom, I'm showing you apple blossoms, and then obviously an apple, but we're just showing you the ovary as it looks in the flower, and then the ovary as it looks in the mature ovary or fruit. So angiosperms are classified traditionally based on whether they have one or two cotyledons, which are seed leaves. And we know now that that's not the best way to classify them based on genetic evidence, because dicots technically are a couple different lineages evolutionarily, but I think for the purposes of this class it's perfectly fine to just say monocot or dicot. So the monocots have one seed leaf, they have parallel leaf veins. A good example of this would be corn. I'm sure you've seen the large leaves that cover corn cobs. They have flower parts that come in multiples of 3. Vascular bundles are scattered, so that's the xylem and the phloem are going to be scattered all throughout the stem. You might not be able to see it because of my picture, but they have thin, wispy, fibrous roots. Dicots have the 2 seed leaves. They have net-like or branching leaf veins, flower parts that come in multiples of 4 or 5, vascular bundles arranged in a ring, and then they have one primary taproot as opposed to lots of wispy little fibrous roots. We can also classify them based on their growing season. So if they bloom and die all in one season, those are annuals. If it takes 2 seasons, those are biennials. And if they keep coming back every year, those are perennials. A good example of a perennial would be grass. We can also classify them based on whether they're herbaceous or woody. So if they have a flexible green stem, they're herbaceous. And a lot of flowers that you would plant in your yard are going to be herbaceous. A lot of things that you would plant in a garden, fruits and vegetables, are going to be herbaceous. And then trees and shrubs are going to be woody. They don't necessarily have to have bark, but if they have a brown, tough stem, like a shrub would, then those are woody as well. So for example, an iris is going to be a perennial, which means it comes back every year. It lives for several years. You don't have to replant them. They're monocots. They have one seed leaf, and they're herbaceous because they have green, fleshy stems. So before we go over the reproductive cycle for angiosperms, we just need to go over some terminology as far as the anatomy of flowers. And I'm just going to use a generic flower here, even though there's lots of different varieties. So when the flower is first blooming, you're going to have these modified leaves called sepals that will actually cover up the flower bud to protect it. Petals obviously are for attracting pollinators. And then you have the female part of the plant, the carpel or pistil. It has a stigma where pollen lands, and then there's a tube called the style where pollen will travel down into the ovary, which contains the ovules. And if the ovules get fertilized, or if the eggs within the ovules get fertilized, then they'll turn into seeds, and the ovary will turn into a fruit. The male part of the flower is called the stamen, and it's composed of an anther that produces pollen, and that's held up by a filament. So I like for you guys to see the ovary with the ovules inside and compare it to the mature ovary or fruit with the seeds inside of it. So you can see here we've got the ovary with the ovules or seeds. You can still see our style, the stigma, and that's still all present in the fruit. It's just not quite as obvious. And of course, you've got that mature fruit with the seeds or ovules. This is the life cycle of an angiosperm, and I don't think you need to memorize this entire thing. I just think it's nice to reiterate that the sporophyte, which is diploid, is the dominant phase for angiosperms, and then the gametophytes are going to be the sperm and essentially the ovules, even though that's not technically correct. Technically, it's an embryo sac in the ovule, but that's neither here nor there. For the purposes of this class, you can know ovule is the gametophyte that's going to give rise to the eggs. And of course, the pollen gives rise to the sperm. And once fertilization occurs, that ovule becomes a seed, and it can germinate and grow into a new plant. Pollination occurs whenever pollen lands on the stigma of a neighboring plant of the same species. And plants look different based on how they're pollinated. So when pollinated species have really small inconspicuous flowers, and that allows for wind to better reach the anthers and blow that pollen away to a neighboring plant. And typically they produce a lot more pollen than other types of flowering plants and cause a lot of allergies for people. So grass would be an example. And then just the traditional brightly colored, pretty fragrant flowers are going to be they're going to be pollinated by most likely insects or birds. So once pollination occurs, pollen is going to travel down that style into the ovary, and it will reach the ovule. And at that point, fertilization occurs. So the pollen gives rise to sperm, and the ovule gives rise to eggs. And they unite to form a zygote and the plant embryo. And at that point, the ovule becomes a protected seed. And the tissue around it, the ovary, is going to turn into a fruit. Seed dispersal in angiosperms is more efficient than it is in gymnosperms. With gymnosperms, it's just they fall from the tree. But with angiosperms, they produce this ovary or fruit, and that's oftentimes eaten by an animal, and it travels through their digestive tract, and it's dispersed elsewhere, and it could even be miles away from the original plant. Some have burrs to hitchhike rides on animals, and some are modified to be carried by the wind. Okay, so last we'll go through what's called vegetative reproduction, which is a type of asexual reproduction in plants that does not involve fertilization. So in this case, the plants are creating clones of themselves using mitosis. Examples include stolons, which are horizontal stems that run above ground, and you see this in strawberries. Rhizomes are similar, but they are underground stems, and that includes irises and ginger. Tubers are also underground stems, and they're modified for storage, so they get rather large, and that's useful to us if we want to eat carbohydrates. So an example would be potatoes. And also bulbs are an underground stem that's modified for storage. And as our last example of vegetative reproduction. And we can use this to our advantage aside from just eating the food. We can actually clone plants ourselves. You can take cuttings, which are usually just pieces of stem, to regrow an entire new plant. You can also do grafting. For species that won't grow from cuttings, you can actually attach them to an already existing plant. And that's typically how oranges are grown and also apples. And if you grafted a couple different apple species to one tree, you could have a tree that actually fruits with multiple types of apples. So that is all for reproduction and classification for angiosperms. And now you guys can do your virtual flower dissection.